here this afternoon at Kerrytown Concert House. It is not without folks like you sitting in these seats enjoying our concerts that we would still be here after 40 years celebrating our 40th anniversary. Wow. So thank you for being a part of our community here. I want to mention that the art on our walls right now is by a wonderful, cherished area artist who was also our former art curator here at Kerrytown Concert House, Nancy Wolf. And she has also selected a curated wall of art from her students at the Hannon Center in Detroit to be featured as well. So please take your time while you're here, look around. If you're interested in purchasing anything, you can talk to me after the show. There's also information about a reception for her exhibit in your program inserts. I want to remind you to turn off or silence all cell phones. As I like to say, we have plenty of music to share on stage here. I don't need any from your pockets. I want to say hello and welcome to everyone on the live stream. Please consider a donation if you are able. All right, and the reason you are all here today is to continue this delightful series that we've had with Ellen Rowe and Paul Keller and Pete Siers for many, many years. And I can't mention how beloved this series is. And today she is featuring a number of Detroit pianists, Detroit jazz pianists. And in fact, this is part 2 because I couldn't get through everyone the last time she did this feature. So you're going to hear a lot about some of your favorite Detroit jazz pianists. And I also want to thank, we have a group of sponsors listed in your program. I can't memorize them all in my head, but we have a group of sponsors listed on the front page of your program for this series, and I want to give them a big round of applause and a big thank you for supporting all of our trio series. We also have a special guest who's sitting in on this afternoon's program, but I will let Ellen introduce him when it comes time. So without further ado, Ellen knows all about the trio, Detroit Jazz Pianists, Part 2.
Thank you so much. We're doing things a little bit differently today. You may notice that Pete and Paul are not with me right now. I assure you they are fine. They will be out here after the first number, so you will be actually hearing the trio for the rest of the afternoon. I wanted to start things off with this lovely Barry Harris solo piano piece called Ascension. And in order to figure out what on earth he was doing, I transcribed it note for note, did a little bit of his solo, the improvised solo that he does, and then I'll improvise the rest of it myself. But this just, I think, gives us a good idea of the spirit and the joy in Detroit in general, and the special qualities that these Detroit pianists we're going to talk about today encompass. So I hope you enjoy this. It is called Ascension. It's a great pleasure to bring Pete and Paul out to the stage. All right, so I hope you can hear maybe some of the harmonies and the brilliant inventiveness going from gesture to gesture in there. Suddenly there's octaves and there's these left-hand kind of almost bagpipe-sounding figures going on. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Barry later in the show, but we wanted to start things off on the right foot there. We're going to move now to one of the unsung Detroit heroes, and that is Bess Bonnier. And I met Bess a couple times, which was fortunate. I got here in '96, and so got to overlap with her a couple years. And I wish I had gotten to know her better because she was quite a character. I'm going to ask Pete and Paul to share some stories because they actually played with her. Bess was born in 1928. She was blind from birth. She studied classical piano as a child, and somehow, and I would love to get the missing information here, she went from studying classical piano as a child to playing her first big band gig at age 13. Not quite sure what transpired, but there you have it. She went to Southeastern High School and then went on to Wayne State, where she studied English and music. Her studies there were interrupted because she had 3 children and was a single mother, and so she had to take time off. But she did resume her studies, and in 1960, I think, she went back and got her master's in English. So that was pretty inspiring to me to hear that. She released her first album, which was called The Theme for the Tall One in 1958, with Nick Fury on bass and Dick Reardon on drums, and thanks to Paul for the personnel on that one. It's out of print, and it's considered a collector's item now by jazz aficionados, so you might want to keep an eye out for it. Later albums of hers with the 26th Floor, an album called Duet to Quartet, Bess Bonnier and Other Jazz Birds, album called Love Notes from 1997, and Sweet William, a jazz cantata with lyrics by William Shakespeare. She did that in 1994 with Paul and Pete and Kerry Kocher. She also was on an album with Jack Brokenshaw, a great Detroit vibraphonist that she worked with frequently, and that was called, and you guys were on that as well, right? Xmas? Yeah, Xmas. It was a holiday CD. Her career spanned 6 decades, and as I mentioned, she worked frequently with Jack at a club in the Detroit New Center area. She also taught piano. Many students went through the Bess Bonnier School of Jazz Pedagogy, including Geri Allen, who we're going to be talking about later. And then some names that might be familiar to you because they're playing in this area as we speak: Michael Malice, Duncan McMillan, and I believe Duncan actually lived in her basement, right? That sounds a little strange. Let me rephrase that. Duncan lived in a basement apartment in her house.
Very nice place. It wasn't a dungeon.
Oh, shoot, we don't have mics. Hey, Nick, we don't have mics for Pete and Paul. Maybe I'll just pass the mic around. Make sure we get their comments on the live stream as well. So highlights for Bess include a performance in 1981 at the Detroit Jazz Summit in New York City with Barry Harris, Tommy Flanagan, and Roland Hanna, an invitation to perform a solo concert at the Library of Congress in 2006, and then she was a regular performer at the Montreux Detroit Festival, it was called then, and of course the Michigan Jazz Festival at Schoolcraft. She received the Michigan Award for Jazz in 1990, the State of Michigan Governor's Award, and in 1994 she was named Musician of the Year by SEMJA, Southeastern Michigan Jazz Association. She also served on many boards and advisory committees advocating for the arts education, and improving accessibility for people with disabilities. So since they had more experience with her than I did, I am going to turn this mic over to Pete and Paul.
I was really lucky to be here at a time when Bess was really quite prolific, and my connection was through Paul. And but we played various gigs, and she was just an integral kind of mover and a shaker in her own vision of what the music should be like. She always had was quite project-minded, which was a huge lesson at that time for me to understand. Let's create this body of work, finish it, kind of push it into the community, and then go on to the next project. It just seemed like a really complete way to put your mark on what was going on in your music at that time. She was quite delightful to be around. She was tiny. She was forceful. And, you know, she was blind. We had this conversation about going to her house to rehearse, and it was quite amazing to see her move around her house because she knew exactly where everything was. Quite interesting and super fun to be around. If you were in the car with her, she would tell you how to drive. That's how she was. So musically, she was quite different than anybody else in terms of like, I'm a rhythm section guy, right? So her eighth note of swing was not a super greasy, triplety, boom, get doom. But it was not like that. It was a little bit more European, kind of straight up and down, which was quite unique and really affected the way you heard it and my response to that. So what I can say, perhaps George Shearing and George's kind of early period had a little bit more straight up and down kind of feel to it, but she had her own way of playing. It was quite forceful and consistent. Like when she was gonna lay a tune on us, it was done, and she could just play it really well. So I really enjoyed being in her company. I miss her. There's certain things that happened on gigs that were really great. I think that Love Notes was the first record we did, so anyway, that's my love for Bess Bonnier.
I think we both just feel a deep sense of gratitude that she brought us into her little orbit, and we not only learned from her and did 1,000 gigs together. I'll bet we did 1,000 gigs together. I'll bet over the years, and I drove her to every one of them, and I took her home to every one of them. But she was also a connection to Detroit past, and she was a role model. Especially, we had such great respect for her because by the time we came in, her kids were grown. But she was a single mother as a jazz musician, and she sidelined as a poet. And she somehow she made it work, and she lived in a great house on Grayton Avenue, and with enough planning, she moved into a bigger house in Grosse Pointe. Okay, I could go on and on about this, and we gotta play some music, but I have to tell you, the first time I ever met Bess Bonnier. Pete and I played in Grand Rapids. This is before I even moved to Ann Arbor, so this is over 40 years ago, 45 years ago. Well, I can tell you exactly when it was, 1984. So that's, 40 years. 40, yeah. Our friend and mentor, John Shea, the piano player, was from Battle Creek, but he came all the way over here on a consistent basis to take lessons with Bess Bonnier. So we always thought, wow, who is this great Bess Bonnier? We have to check her out. We kind of worshipped her from afar in Grand Rapids. One day, John Shea and I came over to see her play at the Detroit Institute of Art in the Crystal Gallery. And it was a magical experience, and she was so happy to see John, and I was happy to meet her, and Patty Richards was there. And she said, come on over to my house. And so we went over to her house afterwards, and I couldn't believe that we were in her house and socializing and playing a little bit. And then she said, let's go out to Baker's Keyboard Lounge and see Johnny O'Neill. And we all sat there together, and it was so great. And then it started to rain, and it rained, and it rained, and it rained, and I pulled my car up, and everybody got in the car, and somebody pulled in behind us. And, oh, by the way, this is my first time ever in Detroit. So I'm at Baker's Keyboard Lounge and at her house, and now somebody's blocking us in. And I was a little frightened. And she got out of that car and she went to the other guy and she said, bang, 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 bang. We're trying to get out of here. Back it up. And she got back in the car. She said, we backed out. And from Baker's Keyboard Lounge, it blew my mind. She directed me all the way home, up to 8 Mile. Turn right. Okay, get on the highway. Turn right. Merge left. Get off at Kaju. Turn left. Turn right on Grayton. There we were. It was quite an experience. And from that moment on, this end of the story was, I can tell you what the date was, 1984. It was the day that the Detroit Tigers won the World Series. Because we went, all four of us went up into her bedroom and we turned on the TV and I watched her put her nose right up on the screen and say, there's Kirk Gibson. Yeah, and we looked around and she had nose prints all over her TV screen. So there's a 7-layer story of my first time ever playing with Bess Bonnier. And it went on for another 10 years. And it was beautiful. Oh, and so why don't I just say it, huh? I'll just say, here's the next tune. Yeah. How honored am I that she wrote a song especially for me? And it was, she took the chord changes of All of Me and she wrote a bass line that we all play together, and it's called All of Paul. How about that? Yeah.
By the way, I just want to add that the spirit of mentorship that Paul just described is what pervades Detroit jazz. The legacy, it's just remarkable. You're going to hear more about that later. Bess Bonnier. So now, we move on to a great friend, former colleague of mine, Geri Allen. There is so much to say about Geri. We're going to have to do some picking and choosing here. She actually deserves her own show, probably several of them. And I will say that I am relying heavily for this show on the amazing book that Mark Stryker wrote. And I hope if you don't have it, you will run out and get it if you're interested in Detroit jazz, called Jazz from Detroit, and also the documentary film that he made that was so remarkable. And run out and see that too if you get a chance. So I will be quoting a bit from Mark's book. So Geri was born in 1957 and passed away tragically, I would say, at the age of 60. 2017, long bout with cancer, but she was a very private person and kept it to herself, so the jazz community was completely shocked when they learned of her passing, as were her students. So it was very, very unfortunate. I honored her, and she took me into her confidence, and so I knew what she was battling, but it was very hard to witness. Geri was with us at Michigan for 10 years, starting I think 2003, and then she got a position, an offer from the University of Pittsburgh, where she got her master's degree, and she unfortunately decided that she needed to go back to her alma mater, and she left us. We were heartbroken. But Mark Stryker describes her as a pianist, composer, conceptualist, and teacher, which I love, because it means that yes, she absorbed tons of influences in her life, studied the masters like we all try to do, but she turned that all into something fresh and unique that was just her. He also calls her a game changer, which I could not agree more with. He mentions the influence she had on a whole slew of young progressive pianists in the early 2000s, including Vijay Iyer, Chris Davis, Craig Taborn, Jason Moran, and Matt Mitchell. In a tribute after her death, Jason Moran said the quote, "She was the one who pulled together all the histories." I love that. Here's a quote from Mark. My stickies here, so you would have to watch me fumble. So Mark writes, Allen sounded like herself from the start. On her landmark 1984 debut LP, The Printmakers, as well as follow-ups Homeground, Open on All Sides, and Twilight, she assimilates swing, blues, funk, free jazz, atonalism, futurism, and African music into a singular voice, while avoiding superficial pastiche. Her puzzle box compositions and improvisations are rife with veiled riddles, secret passageways, and unexpected devices. Spellbinding vamps and bass lines support brittle melodies, jabbing rhythms, disjunctive counterpoint between her hands, odd meters, and night music harmony. I'm not quite sure exactly what Mark means by that, I have to ask him. The skittering attack and asymmetry of her phrasing on a composition like A Celebration of All Life suggests music moving forward and backward at the same time. Oh, sorry, but wait, there's more. And then he says, Vijay Iyer put it this way in a social media post after her death. Her improvisations were full of space, thought, and listening, as well as a liberatory quality. Her groove was deep, her contrapuntal independence often shocking. Her lines and voicings were fresh and unique. She would seem at times to play with great reserves of calm, but when she chose to step up, she would dazzle with fearless virtuosity. She was at home with experimentalism and tradition, embracing new technologies and old. Yes, a few more details here. She grew up in Pontiac, where she was born in Pontiac and grew up in northwest Detroit. Her father was a teacher and a principal in the Detroit Public Schools, which I think has a lot to do with her absolute devout commitment to education. She started piano lessons at age 7. Her parents enforced very strict practice rules. She had to do her homework and practice first before she was allowed to go outside. Her father played Charlie Parker and Duke Ellington for her, among others, and by the time she entered Cass Tech, she knew that she wanted to be a jazz musician, which for a young woman was a pretty daring career choice. I love it. She met Marcus Belgrave, speaking of mentors, at Cass, and he taught her harmony, encouraged her to learn jazz standards, and started to hire her for gigs as a high school student. Once again, mentorship, right? He took her for piano lessons with Bess Bonnier, who said that Geri absorbed the music as swiftly as any student she'd ever had, and Marcus also protected her from some of the boys who were dismissive of her as a female jazz piano player at school. She went on to Howard, majored in jazz studies, studying with John Malachi, who had played with Billy Eckstine and Sarah Vaughan. And after graduating, she went to New York and studied with Kenny Barron, who, this gives me a chance to put in a plug, is our special guest artist in residence starting March 31st through April 3rd at U of M. March 31st, we are going to have an interview. Mark Stryker is going to interview Kenny at 6 o'clock in Keverson Rehearsal Hall. And unfortunately, we are not allowed to advertise this publicly because there's not enough time to place all the chairs in a fire code specific way. So therefore, we have to set up the chairs ourselves. It will not be up to fire code, and we cannot announce it publicly. But you are all welcome to attend. I guarantee you there will be no fires. We'll also have the honor to share a stage with Kenny Barron at the Arc on Thursday, April 3rd. It will be our jazz showcase. We'll have our student groups play the first half, and then Kenny will come out and play with various faculty members on the second half, Bob Hurst and Nate Wynn and others. Okay, end of plug. Oh yeah, after graduating, she went to study with Kenny Barron, and at that point decided, after she had been with him for a while, that she wanted to go back and get a master's degree in ethnomusicology. And she had an offer from University of Pittsburgh to go there, and so she was planning to go, and she did go, but before she went, she had a call from Art Blakey, who had heard her on a gig in New York, and the dream phone call for most young jazz musicians at the time, an opportunity to go play with Art Blakey. She turned him down because she had an obligation. She felt to go to get her master's degree. She had, signed on the dotted line. She thought she really needed her master's. And she said no to Art Blakey. I think that's pretty remarkable. Okay, just a few more notes here, and then we'll play some music, and we'll introduce our student, Liam. Her first recording as a leader was 1984. Mark mentioned this album, The Printmakers. She recorded 22 more albums as a leader throughout her life, in addition to another 30 as a side woman. Between 84 and 92, her albums included 5 with Charlie Hayden and Paul Motion, and that was an extremely important trio. So if you get a chance to hear some Geri from that period with that band, I highly recommend it. In 1993, and this was something I didn't realize, I should have known this about her, I guess we never talked about it, she toured with Betty Carter for about 9 months. And she said that set her on a track that incorporated slightly more mainstream language into her playing. She recorded the album 21 in 1994 with Ron Carter and Tony Williams. And she comments about Betty Carter in Mark's book. So grab that. My stickies are here to save you from endless flipping of pages. She says, after playing with Betty, her solos often retained her previous rhythmic rumble, and Carter responds with some of her most inspired singing. And then Geri says, I don't know if my playing changed as much as it crystallized with Betty, Ellen said. She wanted a certain fleetness and snap. She was coming from a place where the trio was a well-honed, well-rehearsed, well-oiled sports car. She made me realize that how I positioned myself philosophically as a pianist had a lot to do with who would call me and who wouldn't. I started to really understand what it was the band leader was interested in, what kind of personality the core trio should represent. That's helped me move in and out of different settings. Betty introduced me to the broader jazz community. A couple other albums I want to mention in case you have a chance. The Gathering from 1998, and then her interpretation of Mary Lou Williams' Zodiac Suite, 2006, a solo piano album, Flying Towards the Sound in 2008, which I know Liam is very familiar with, and Grand River Crossings from 2012, where she covered Motown hits with what Mark describes as a glowing transparency. That is also a beautiful album. It reminds me a bit of what Herbie Hancock did with the new standards in his album The Possibilities, where he also covered current pop tunes but orchestrated them in such a way that they just took on a whole new freshness. So in addition to teaching and performing, Geri started the Geri Allen Jazz Camp. At the time, it was just called Female Jazz Residency in Newark, and after her passing, Regina Carter took it over, and we renamed it the Geri Allen Jazz Camp. But it was just for young women, and of course it addressed everything you would expect: improvisation, theory, harmony, but it also got into business and how young women should, make a career how they could make a career for themselves. And she brought in a tap dancer. Everybody learned to tap dance. I was privileged to be a part of that camp and to teach there. And unfortunately, is no longer in existence. And in 2016, a year before her passing, she took on the artistic directorship of the Carr Center in Detroit. So VJ, I want one more quote from VJ Iyer. Her improvisations were, make sure. Oh, sorry, I already read this. Okay, I was gonna say, this is really familiar. I already talked about VJ. Okay, so I think what we'd like to do now is I'd like to play a piece. I wrote this in honor of Geri and Mary Lou Williams, who is an important influence on Geri. And it was for my Momentum group, so it's an octet. And what I decided to do is just try to reduce the 5 horn parts onto the piano. We'll see how that goes. But what you can listen for in this is that I was trying to kind of marry Lou Williams' left hand with Geri's kind of rhythmic punches and dissonances in the right hand, and also some use of whole tone scales. I put some of those in the boogie bass line as well. So this is an attempt to honor both Mary Lou Williams and Geri Allen, and it's called The Soul Keepers. Let's all play this. One, two,
Thank you.
I love most about these concerts is the opportunity to bring a student up to share his love or her love with the subject at hand. Liam Sharon is in his senior year, very sadly. We're trying to figure out how we can flunk him to keep him around a little bit longer. He doesn't know this, but he is a huge fan of Geri's. I've asked him to play something that he has lovingly transcribed, an unbelievable piece of music of hers, and talk a little bit about her. Liam Sharon.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to Ellen, or Professor Rowe, as I know her, for having me playing here on this piano in this room. Is always an honor. I just learned hearing Professor Rowe speak that Geri started teaching at U of M the year that I was born, which is kind of crazy to think about. But I first heard Geri play on her great record called Some Aspects of Water with Paula Danielson and Lenny White and Johnny Coles. I would say it's maybe one of her more accessible records. And so at the time, I didn't really understand the crazy depth and range of things that she did and just her ethos as a player. Another great contemporary pianist named Ethan Iverson recently wrote an article just about her recordings from before 1990. And the way that he described it, that, as you might notice, I don't have any books or papers, I'm not as prepared as Ellen, but the way that he described her playing was that every album that she's on becomes an event when Geri Allen is playing on it. I think it's so true. And yeah, for me, her playing is just like a really good example of the way music a lot of times defies any sort of explanation, any sort of sense in the way that we codify it. But it wrenches you, it grips you, and it pulls you, and it stretches what you think is real and what's not real. And I think Geri Allen really exemplifies that spirit in her playing. And it's also so almost whimsically off-kilter. Like, it's so kind of refreshing to have her come out in jazz history in a sense where on the piano, people like Kenny Kirkland and Herbie Hancock were moving a very specific axis of really really almost perfect piano playing harmonically and rhythmically, and she introduced this great, like, compelling sound that was totally different but yet so meaningful. And yeah, my favorite records, many of them Ellen mentioned. I love The Printmakers, which is where the tune that I'm about to play comes from. Homegrown, Feed the Fire with Betty Carter. That one's so awesome. Timeless Portraits and Dreams, she made when she was teaching at the school with Ron Carter and Jimmy Cobb and a host of other people. Yes, everybody needs a little bit more Geri Allen in their life. The tune that I'm about to play is a little bit of a marathon, so you're gonna watch me sweat, which is, what you came for. But it's a piece called When Kabuya Dances, and I think the beautiful part about this piece is that it's centered around these engines that Geri creates in her left hand. You'll hear a lot of driving, rolling left-hand figures, and over that, she puts these really almost floating melodies over, and it's a piece that you can sink into, and also a piece that almost feels like a series of episodes, one after another, and so it's a beautiful challenge for any pianist to kind of approach and see how you shape it and how you mold it. And yeah, I mean, as Ellen explained, you'll hear a lot of really jarring, kind of gut-wrenching harmonic approaches to the tune, a lot of really juxtaposed rhythms. Geri was a technical master of the piano, as anybody who ever met her could say. And so you can hear this breadth of touch and emotion and expression just in the sound that she gets out of these things. And so yeah, I'm gonna give it my best shot. And so without further ado, this is When Kabuya Dances.
amazing. All right, next up here. Yes, Barry Harris. Well, we could also talk for hours about Barry, and I know we're going to try to get through our entire program and not keep you past, say, 3:15. So I will just maybe give you a few comments about Barry, and then we'll play one of his tunes. Same interesting, a lot of these pianists were kind of in the same time span, as you might imagine. Barry, however, was quite a bit older than Geri, born in 1929, and passed away fairly recently, 2021. He started lessons with his mother, who was a church pianist, and she asked him if he wanted to play church music or jazz, and he chose jazz, and she was kind enough to allow him to pursue that instead of church music. 1953, he landed a gig as a house pianist at the Bluebird Inn, which is where he met all the traveling artists who came through Detroit. You name them, they ended up at the Bluebird. He worked with Miles, Sonny Stitt, Thad Jones. He substituted for Junior Mance in the Gene Ammons band. And he was a classmate of Berry Gordy, which I think is interesting, at Northeastern High. His main influence was probably Bud Powell, and he learned Bud Powell's solos by ear, and I think this is incredible because today we have, if you want to learn transcribe a solo, you've got YouTube, and YouTube has got variable speed, and you just change the setting, and there you are. And it's not as hard as it was in the day when you're trying to deal with, cassette recorders, things like that, and couldn't really slow them down. But what he did was he borrowed a variable speed record player from a friend. And so he had a record player that could actually run slow, but I think it still brought the pitch down so that you weren't actually hearing the right, correct pitches, but he would slow it down so that he could hear the lines that Bud Powell was playing, and then he would transpose them up into the correct key. From the New York Times, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but one of the big things that we want to talk about with Barry is just his absolute, again, dedication to passing on what he knew to younger players, but also to having these shows at his house, his mother's house, before he moved out, and all the traveling artists who were coming through town would stop at his house to play, and they would hang out, and it's here he started to develop his affinity for teaching. The New York Times obituary said he started hosting informal lessons at his mother's house, and musicians with considerably more experience often sought out his off-the-cuff symposiums, hoping to seep up what he called his rules, exercises and frameworks that could help them unpack the complex but often unwritten structures of bebop. He also, and then I'll say that he moved to New York in 1960 to join Cannonball Adderley's band, found a lot of work. He was a kind of flexible player, I think, from a variety of experiences he'd had in Detroit. He could play solo gigs, he could play in a small band. He was able to accompany older style players like Coleman Hawkins, who was not technically a bebop player, but kind of a pre-bop player. And he could accompany tap dancers, which I did not know. And then he worked extensively with Coleman at the Village Vanguard. I've got a quote from Mark here. Here we go. So Mark writes that Harris was barely into his 20s when he began to mentor slightly younger players like Paul Chambers, Doug Watkins, Donald Byrd, Curtis Fuller, and Pepper Adams. His second wave of students included Charles McPherson, Lonnie Hillier, Roy Brooks, and Joe Henderson. Yusuf Lateef studied with Harris, and so did future Motown bassist James Jamerson and countless others in Detroit. As Harris's reputation grew, musicians traveling through town stopped by to see what he was up to. McPherson recalls seeing Sonny Rollins and John Coltrane at Harris's home on separate occasions in the mid-50s. Coltrane pulled a chair up to the piano one afternoon and asked Harris, "What is it you're doing these days?" So that's kind of stunning. So he recorded 25 albums as a leader, at least 80 albums as a sideman, which shows what demand he was in. Accumulated many honors and several honorary doctorates. He started teaching at the Jazz Cultural Center in New York City in 1988, and literally thousands of musicians, young players, went through the doors of that. It was nominally $5 to come in and sit down and be a part of the class, and the classes would sometimes just go on for 5 or 6 hours at a time. And let's see, primarily a performance venue, it also hosted jam sessions as well as Barry's improvisation classes. He often taught 7 days a week and even created a choir composed of children from the neighborhood. He never stopped teaching the classes, continuing until the pandemic shut things down in March, and then he conducted them via Zoom into 2021. yeah, there's so much to say about Barry, but I think the major thing to take away is that he was one of the pioneers of, along with Bud Powell and Thelonious Monk, of bebop and in jazz piano playing. And when we talk about bebop, we talk about the rhythmic intensity, whereas maybe in the swing era, you had more lines that were on the beat. So if I'm conducting be-da-da-boo, ba-ba-doo-doo, ba-ba-doo-ba-da, everything feels kind of nice and rolling along in the beat. Bebop comes along, you got be-da-da-ga-da-do-da-da-do-da-da, right? Things are off the beat, more angular rhythms. And then the melodic vocabulary changes up. So you might have scales and arpeggios that you might expect in melodic improvisation. In the pre-bop years, bebop players come along and they start adding in all these extra notes. So you might have, I like, we were talking the other day, I liken it to a road map. You get on a map and you have the closest way to get from point A to point B. But bebop players started taking the scenic route. Okay, so we started adding in all these chromatic half steps and little dip downs and dip aboves and making the music far more challenging to play, but at least the music, the heads that were written out became much more challenging, like the Charlie Parker tunes that we all know and love. And so we're going to, I think I might demonstrate this a little bit right now, and I'll demonstrate it again before we play Terry Pollard's tune. We're going to play, though, now a beautiful tune that Barry wrote called Like This. And anybody want to say anything about Barry?
I'll say something quickly before we play this. Once again, I was lucky to play with this guy, Barry Harris. I played with him about a dozen times, and it struck me that this show is different than every other show we've ever done, because we're talking about people that we knew. We really had personal relationships with Geri Allen and Bess Bonnier and Tommy Flanagan and Hank Jones and Barry Harris, and so maybe that's why we go on and on a little bit. But that's okay, we knew these guys, and so I thought that was worth mentioning. I don't know exactly how many times I played with him. I played with him a couple of times at the Detroit Jazz Festival. I have a picture on my wall of the two of us playing, and he's standing and playing the piano. It's pretty, it's cool. We played this song together every time we played together. This is his song called Like This. How's it go? Like this.
intro on Hank Jones. We'll play an arrangement I transcribed of Oh What a Beautiful Morning. Born in 1918, passed away in 2010. I think most of you know he was one of a family of 7. The 2 other most notable musicians in the family were his brothers Thad Jones, the great trumpet player, and Elvin Jones, the monumentally important jazz drummer. Some of his influences included Earl Hines, Art Tatum, and Teddy Wilson. And I guess some of his first experiences also playing publicly were in church, where he played church and played piano and organ. He worked around Michigan and Ohio after he graduated from high school, and then moved on to Buffalo, and I think this is where he first got to hear Art Tatum in person. And I think this is, I do want to mention this, this is from Mark's book. It says that, so he spent more than a year in Buffalo and first heard Art Tatum in person. Tatum's otherworldly technique and head-spinning modulations left even Vladimir Horowitz shaking his head in admiration. And this is what Hank says. He goes, after his last set, we'd go hang out at some restaurant or private home and play until daylight, Jones says. I sat right next to him, or next to the case of Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. Nobody could get between him and his beer. I'd watch his hands, but you couldn't learn very much from watching his hands because they moved so fast. You'd listen to the harmony and what he was playing, and you began to hear certain things, and after a while you recognized what he was doing and then why he was doing it, which was more important. Let's see, a couple little biographical things here, and then we'll move on. Autumn of 47, he toured with Norman Granz at the Jazz at the Philharmonic, and from 1948 to 1953, he was Ella Fitzgerald's accompanist. And she chose very carefully because another one of her most famous jazz pianists from Detroit was Tommy Flanagan, who also served as one of Ella's accompanists. And this is where Hank feels that he started developing his extraordinary harmonic facility. And Paul was mentioning when we rehearsed this morning that if you listen to a lot of those Ella Fitzgerald groups, you don't hear a whole lot of piano solos. The pianist was just there in the background, but it gave the pianist a chance to really hone their accompaniment skills and to come up with some new and unique ways to accompany people. He also played with Charlie Parker and Lester Young. And then from 59 to 75, he was a CBS staff pianist. So he would do things like accompany Frank Sinatra when he went on the Ed Sullivan Show. He is also, little known fact, the pianist who accompanied Marilyn Monroe when she sang Happy Birthday, Mr. President to John F. Kennedy in 1962. Okay, I'm going to scoot ahead here a little bit. I think an important thing about Hank is we know he absorbed all the language of the players who came before him, but he was constantly searching out new language. And some of the albums he made after he finished up at CBS, he started, they named a group that he created, the Great Jazz Trio. It was Ron Carter and Tony Williams. But what's so interesting about this, besides the fact it was one of the first jazz albums I bought, was that when you think about it, Hank must have been about 60, Ron Carter should have been about 37, and Tony Williams was 29. And so he was surrounding himself with younger players. And he says that he loved the challenge of working with young, dynamic players who had such daring imaginations and fast minds. Later on, he also did recordings with the Afro-pop groups, and he did a beautiful, I highly recommend this, album of spirituals, hymns, and folk songs with Charlie Hayden called Steal Away in 1995. Another notable later album included Joyous Encounter with Joe Lovano, and again, Joe at that point was 34 years younger than him and really pushed him in some new harmonic directions. So this is one of the things that I really admire about Hank, was that he never was sitting still. Rumor has it that he practiced up to 8 hours a day when he could, and even into his 80s, we know that he was practicing 2 hours a day minimum, which is very inspiring. All right, I think I've got one last quote, and then we will play. So Hank was so revered by all the pianists who came after him. Here's McCoy Tyner. It's hard to find words for a guy like him because he's so magnificent, said McCoy Tyner. When you listen to him, it's like you're in a concert hall because he covers so much ground. Cedar Walton said, all of us marvel at Hank Jones. Bill Charlap, who's going to be here, I think next week at the Blue Llama, said he's one of the most important pianists in the history of the music period. And then Bill went on to say his style is as profound and defined as any of the major masters. It's equal to Teddy Wilson, equal to Bill Evans, equal to Thelonious Monk, equal to Tommy Flanagan. It's as much a unique musical utterance and just as balanced in terms of intellectualism and feeling. With Hank Jones, you hear the past, present, and the future of jazz piano. He touched all of the players who came after him, including Bill Evans and Herbie Hancock. So with that in mind, I heard this amazing arrangement he did. It may have been one of the Napeck Recital Hall albums of "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning." And I think we all know, "Oh, what a beautiful morning," and we kind of recognize the harmonies. And he had a lot of fun with it, but not in such a way that, you know, makes it feel uncomfortable or that, you know, you don't recognize the song. So I transcribed note for note as Liam did. I went ahead and wrote this down so that I could play it today. And he did it completely solo piano, but I thought it would be silly to not have these guys join in. So in the middle, you'll have Pete and Paul join in. So this is Hank's version of "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning." being so patient with us. We have one last pianist to talk about briefly and one last piece for you, but thank you so much for being here. Let's see, Terry Pollard. So probably one of the greatest bebop jazz pianists you have never heard of. Born 1931 and passed away in 2009. Jazz pianist and vibraphonist. This should not be overlooked. She was a phenomenal vibraphonist. The Detroit scene in the 40s and 50s, she's been described as a major player who is inexplicably overlooked. Mark Stryker says she was electrifying and oft forgotten. So one of the things that brought her some notice was that she was a house pianist at the Bluebird Inn for many years, and this is where she met a lot of the great players she did get to play with, such as Billy Mitchell. I am right over here. Let's see. Once again, started playing piano at an early age. There's no real record of what kind of training she may have had, but she had perfect pitch. And as a teenager, she became the house pianist at the Bluebird Inn, recorded with Billy Mitchell and Thad Jones in 1953. But where she was discovered was by the vibraphonist Terry Gibbs, who heard her playing at the Bluebird and invited her to tour with him, which she did for, I think, four years. She recorded several albums with him, but this is a quote from Terry Gibbs about her. He said, "Then I heard this girl, Terry Pollard, who played piano completely different than any girl I'd ever heard play. She played bebop and she could swing. I thought that maybe because I'd had a few drinks, this was the reason she sounded that good, but that was not the case." There weren't many female jazz players, and the few that were around mostly played piano, ladies like Mary McPartland and Barbara Carroll, but they didn't have that hard bebop articulation that Terry played with. Terry was the first female I ever heard swing that hard. And of course, fortunately nowadays, many female jazz musicians swing that hard. But at the time, she was definitely a rarity. And as I listen to more of her recordings, and there's not that many out there, I'm just blown away at how her facility, her bebop language, she sounds a lot like Bud Powell. Anything you guys want to add about
All these people that we have,
just for that.
everybody we've talked to owes a lot to Bud Powell. They all sound like Bud Powell. Even Geri Allen. I'm sure that's not in the style of Bud Powell, but a lot of it came from Bud Powell. He's kind of the grandfather of all of this bebop stuff. Every one of them, right, Ellen?
Yeah. Okay, the only other things I'm going to say about Terry, because I hope you are all going to go out and find some recordings of her, but please look for a recording that she made with the Terry Gibbs. It's a video it's on YouTube, that she made on the Steve Allen show. And this is the Terry Gibbs Quartet. And she's playing piano, and then she gets up off the piano and starts pushing Terry Gibbs off the vibes, and they go back and forth, and it's just so remarkable. So I think that was 1956. And then, unfortunately for the jazz world, not for her, she decided to leave the road and go back and raise a family. So she dropped out of the national scene, but she still played in Detroit a lot. And there's many people I know out there who did have the opportunity to play with her. We're going to play a piece called Nutty Notes. It is one that she wrote. It's fast, it's fun. But before we do this, I would like to thank all of you so much for being here today. And I also want to thank everyone here who's a member of the Don Chisholm Friends of Jazz. You know who you are. And especially want to thank the people who specifically support the All About the Trio series. And I've got this written down. If I can just, so again, I don't want to leave anybody out. And those would be Ron and Mimi Bogdasarian, Susan and Oliver Cameron, Barbara Kelly, Elizabeth Kirksey in memory of Webb Kirksey, and Patricia Hogberg in memory of David Hogberg. We thank you so much for making this series possible. We couldn't do this without you. And also, none of this happens without the fabulous staff here at Kerrytown. So please, a round of applause for Abby and Nick and, of course, Monica. This is Nutty Notes. You tried.